ginkgo biloba, that's kind of what they started with at Stanford.
Yes,
Some
right.
of us
Ginkgo
use-
biloba is related.
Yeah, so it's ginkgo biloba is obviously not targeted, and they're trying to actually get a target.
Target, exactly right. And then another set of pathways that I'll spend a little time here is this amyloid precursor protein gene overexpression. And then that leads to protein interference with instructions for neurons to thrive, okay? But primarily, one of the real key conditions here is APP, amyloid precursor protein, leads to a cleaved product called A-beta peptide. And it's this A-beta peptide that contributes to the plaques that form both in Alzheimer's disease persons and also persons with Down syndrome. So APP is a known, remember I showed that slide of the chromosome. APP is a gene on human chromosome 21 and on human chromosome 16 in the mouse model. Trisomy 21 leads to overexpression of this APP gene, which is a known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And now, primarily coming out of Dr. Mobley's group at UCSD, small molecules are being tested to reduce APP levels in mice to improve cognition. So that's the work that we're funding along with DSRTF, and they're making pretty good progress there. Okay.
And is Mobley studying a new drug, or is he using some of the Alzheimer's medications now?
No, he's looking at another drug specifically.
Okay.
There's another pathway that's being investigated by Dr. Salehi, connected with Stanford, but he's actually at the VA Medical Center out in Palo Alto. And he just reported on this a year ago, and we're granting him to continue these studies. This is where they are improving contextual learning that I described, as tested by nest building in the mouse model, by administering a combination of drugs that restore norepinephrine concentrations. Okay, so norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. You wouldn't want to add norepinephrine because that leads to seizures and that sort of a thing. But if you can come in with something that somehow upregulates norepinephrine, in the mouse model, what they're demonstrating is that's improving learning with these contextual learning tests, nest building. Just to take you back to the APP, this is a study that was reported from UCLA in the summer. It's on our website. It's a pretty amazing study. They actually are able to now, with a marker, go in and light up brains. Light up, a simple term. They actually have stains, and you can test and look at brains of subjects. Okay, so the studies. Studies indicate all persons with Down syndrome show signs of brain pathology by the age of 40. Any scientist you talk to will say, if you look at the brain of a person 40 years and older with Down syndrome, you're starting to show signs of. And that was primarily done with autopsies and so forth. But this recently published study from UCLA used a chemical marker that binds the plaques and tangles that I described, created by an abundance of A-beta peptide, which is due to overexpression of the APP gene. And they're getting these new neural images. Here's a control subject, 52-year-old. Here's a person with Down syndrome, age 61. And here you can see the blue area, primarily blue, that shows control subject. Alzheimer's disease, you see these, what's kind of yellow or green here. This is representative of plaques and tangles. And here's a couple of brain images of a person 33 years old with Down syndrome and 59. And here you're starting to get the actual, actual in vivo demonstration of the plaques and tangles that are being formed here. Of course, at 59 years old, it's very much like a person with Alzheimer's disease, but that certainly is indicative of what has always been assumed, that these plaques and tangles are forming at a younger age in Down syndrome than in a non-Down syndrome population, which contributes to the known fact that there's an increased likelihood of cognitive decline tied to this sort of a condition in Down syndrome and earlier onset. And the research that some of the researchers are reporting is trying to get to this. This is not acceptable. just a couple of interesting points. You may know some of these things. Okay, so I talked about there's potential that these new drugs discovered in Down syndrome might help us understand and treat Alzheimer's disease. Do you know that there's a much lower incidence of certain types of hard tumors in persons with Down syndrome? Why is that? Okay, and that, you know, breast cancer, those types of cancers, you just don't see hard tumors formed in persons with Down syndrome. And there's some pretty new information coming out that it's tied to perhaps overexpression of molecules that regulate formation of blood vessels. Okay, so if you have a hard tumor that's starting to form, what happens is masses of blood vessels come and form around it to feed the tumor. Well, persons with Down syndrome don't demonstrate these hard tumors, and they're surmising that there's a gene expressed 50% greater that is impacting the ability of blood vessels to form around this tumor. And that's why I don't see the hard tumor. So can you imagine what this might help researchers understand in terms of how they might be able to treat breast cancer as an example, okay? So, and also, it's a known fact that persons with Down syndrome have far less atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, that type of condition, as opposed to the non-Down syndrome population. What's causing that? Less information known about that than the middle item I was discussing, but nonetheless, interesting things. It's something that we speak to the general population about how, you know, our community of persons with Down syndrome, they're extraordinary as family members, okay, as community members in schools. But it's also by studying persons with Down syndrome, we're learning things too. So.
Are the breast cancer researching folks getting fired up about that at all, or is that?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, you know, yeah. I can't cite specific studies, but they're reading these journal articles, and there's research being done. Okay. I'm not a parent, okay, but you know, I'm meeting a lot of all of you, and I'm not going to go through these. These are just some of the quotes that mean a lot to me. You might read these and have some similar feelings. The one on the bottom, though, is something that Paul Watson, who's in Texas, his young son Nathan is maybe 7 or 8 now. And he said, Bob, you know, families ahead of us, pioneering families, fought to bring their kids out of institutions, okay, and then into their homes, and then into schools, okay. So previous generations worked really, really hard to move from the Sunshine Home, like where my cousin is in Toledo, Ohio, who's 54 or something like that, to where people are living in homes and are included in schools and having opportunities in education. That's what the pioneering families did a generation ago, and now to a degree. It's our turn, okay, my turn, your turn, to lead for our kids with Down syndrome to unlock their learning and free them from the grip of Alzheimer's development, okay? How are we going to do that? By supporting the research that I've described. Advocating, communicating, informing, making people aware, whatever it takes. That's what we need to be doing now. That's the next step. Somebody described to me as a pyramid, you know, that, okay, we're so successful in moving beyond the tragedy of including children and putting children in institutions. So that's the base, and we're working our way up to some really revolutionary research that might truly enhance learning opportunities for persons with Down syndrome, okay? So that's a key point I want to leave you with here. Just a quick summary again. Up to 6 pathways leading to development and maintenance of healthy nerve cells have been identified. Because we're starting to understand these causes, they're beginning to understand that there's potential for therapies to treat this. And then clinicals will be performed to ensure that such therapies would be safe and effective. And I mentioned earlier, these would not cure learning difficulties. Rather, they would be administered the same way. As an example, drugs are administered to help persons with ADD. Okay, so it might be a variety of drugs. Some drugs might work better with one person than another. Okay, too early to predict, but there's not a magic bullet here. But what has to happen is that we need more research to identify and improve our understanding of these pathways and identify other pathways as well. Because maybe it's not just potential of these 6 pathways, but some other ones as well. So more money is needed. Do you talk to a scientist, can use more money? They go, yes. Okay. Or a young scientist and say, would you like to try to identify alternate pathways? I would, but there's no money. Okay, let's create conditions where we don't have to say no to that scientist. A point that I've heard too from parents is that it helps when they learn about this research, it helps them kind of understand organically what's happening in the brains of their children, so that when they're sitting in an IEP discussion across the table from an educator, they can say, like Paul says, Nathan, he's going to learn that what 6 and 8 equals, or what the answer to a question is how to spell something. But it's just going to take a few seconds longer, okay? Just give him a little bit longer, because his nerve cells, as he says, Paul, there's an imbalance, okay, as a parent talking to a teacher. But that's in fact what's really, is you can describe to a teacher what's happening. It helps them kind of understand and be more empathetic, I think, to our cause, and your cause really, in terms of trying to structure learning programs for them, okay? So we're starting to arm persons and parents with objective information here that can be used in the educational community, and then they can take that information in the educational community and then really create learning programs specialized understanding this. Here's this model again, and I kind of walk you through where we're standing here. So all the way through drug optimization, we have the SHH activator, which is trying to increase this sonic hedgehog pathway so that precursors to brain cells become brain cells. The GABA receptor blockers, which would assist and restore proper balance in neurotransmission, APP reduction, and the norepinephrine precursors. So all of these potential drugs and drug targets are going through this process right now. This is where the scientific advisory board comes in. Okay, how far along is the SHH activation studies? Do you need more money? How do we speed up the time to clinical trials, that sort of thing? Or would money be better spent with APP reduction? So there's all these types of discussions. You have limited amount of dollars that we have and DSRTF has, so you have to parse it out as effectively as possible. Okay? Real quickly, as these drugs go through the sequence here, it's important that a method is used to test the efficacy of drugs in a clinical setting, and that's where the Arizona Cognitive Test Battery comes in. Doctors Jamie Nadell and Lynn Nadell and Jamie Edgen in Tucson, University of Arizona, have developed the Arizona Cognitive Test Battery. It's not an overly complex test, shapes and things. It's nonverbal, but it's a set of measures to test efficacy of therapies and outcome of clinical trials. The research they've done so far with this cognitive test battery seems to demonstrate that it's more applicable to ages early teens and up. It doesn't work as well in ages 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay. Part of the reason why the Roche clinical trial, which I'll describe in a little more detail, the subjects are 18 to 33-year-olds. But we're still granting this group with the idea to kind of push so that alternate batteries are available that can be pushed further down in the trials to assist at younger ages in these clinical trials. What's really important, and what the symposium, the Down Syndrome National Research Consortium is working on, is the development of contact registry, so that clinicians can have a source of potential subjects in their clinical trials. You see one with Fragile X or autism, you can go right on their website and you enter in your child's name or your brother's name or whatever, some basic medical information, contact information, and the clinicians then have a source of thousands of potential persons to include in clinical trials. It's really critical. It doesn't exist with Down syndrome right now, but a subgroup of the consortium that I'm on, a group of about 4 or 5 people, have been tasked with rapidly coming up with this contact registry. It's not a difficult thing. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here. We're going to take like the Fragile X one and use it in our application with Down syndrome. The tougher part is how you run this program. Who pays for it? Who's going to be there on the end of the phone call when somebody calls and says, I don't understand what the information they need. So it's going to take money. It's got to reside someplace. Somebody has to, quote, own it and answer to the question. So those are the types of things that are being worked out right now. Anybody can design a website that serves as a database, but it's the stuff beyond that is a little bit more challenging, but it'll get worked out. Under a year, this contact registry will be available. Biobank, which I also mentioned here as well, is just a source of blood samples, other biosamples that could be useful in clinical studies as well. So I talked about clinical trials, and the Roche clinical trial specifically is investigating the safety and tolerability of a molecule addressing the cognitive and behavioral deficits associated with Down syndrome. That's a general statement. Up to 33 individuals in 1 or 2 countries. Here's the targeted age, 18 to 30, but they admit in their press release, we believe, we being Roche, that an earlier intervention in Down syndrome has potential for greater impact, okay? So this study is starting with a low population, but they aren't discounting that the drug trials that are directed towards a younger section of the population could have a greater medical impact. And this molecule is being assessed for its ability to address this imbalance, like I described. So I went through in pretty good detail at this point, but I think that, and I'm not in a hotline to the Roche people, but maybe in the spring they'll have identified enough subjects and so forth and get this trial underway. You know, I have all of your email addresses, so I'll pop them into our email database, and you'll get regular updates on where this Roche trial stands. There's also a link in our website. You go right to their trial site itself and educate yourself on this, okay? So.
Isn't Roche a European drug company?
Yeah, but they have a big outfit in New Jersey.
What 2 countries are they thinking of using?
I know U.S., and I couldn't tell you the other one.
Is
I
there
should
enough
ask
money?
Michael Harpold.
Is there enough money in it for me? I mean, the population of people with Down syndrome is relatively small, and I imagine it's obscenely expensive for them to develop a drug to do this.
It is. It's very expensive. They're making a commitment here, no question, but it is very expensive. You know, to get through a whole clinical trial, it's $30 million.
Is there money on the other end for them with such a small population?
They wouldn't start this if they didn't think so.
Right, that's what I
Okay,
figured.
you know, I know enough of the pharmaceutical industry, having been in it, that you know, sit around the table, and there's been lots of opportunities for drugs. Well, we're not going to do that drug because it's not an opportunity to market it and make money. Down syndrome drugs don't fall into this orphan drug category, so they don't get that kind of benefit. It's kind of above it. But with a worldwide population of 3 million and 400,000 in the United States, and you start thinking about the economics as well, which if we're not talking about a population that as it ages outlives their care, okay, and the societal cost of that, societal cost of educational programs and things, which are great, but there's a cost. So if you do the general economics of this whole thing, we try to make the point that there's a solid economic basis to develop drugs that will to help improve learning in persons with Down syndrome. It's a great question. We wrestle with it all the time. DSRTF would never raise enough money to fund clinical trials. It's going to happen from the large drug companies.
The corporations, sure.
With the corporations themselves. That's where the money comes from.
Right.
Venture capitalism, okay, venture capital stuff, you talked about that. I talked to the business professor at Notre Dame, was with him yesterday. He has a young daughter, Sophie, and one of his research projects is just talking about that. How can venture capital work with these pharmaceuticals to not specifically just Down syndrome, but to incent pharmaceutical companies to invest in this type of thing.
Is there a concern, not concern, but speculation on how this new pregnancy test will affect Down syndrome?
Well, you know, there's a lot going on in the press about this right now. And, you know, parents will, a simple kind of reaction to that is a worry that the simpler the test is, the greater applicability we would see, which would push the population down, which would create less incentive to do this type of a thing.
Is that what they're saying?
You read that. I mean, you can make that sort of a discussion, and you
Yes.
do see it. So, Yes, I mean, Brian Stacko, anybody familiar with his work? He spends a lot of time talking about